The long-term fuel trim is a matrix of cells. It's not a single entity by itself, a single number by itself. Now these cells are going to be arranged by engine RPM and load. Each of the cells of the long-term fuel trim is going to be stored in a register, or we call it a memory. As the engine RPM and load changes, the computer is going to switch from cell to cell. As engine RPM and load changes, these cells represent different RPMs and loads, so the computer is going to use this to determine what the long-term factor is and what it's going to use in its base pulse width at that individual cell. Now we can't show you what a long-term fuel trim memory cell looks like, so we're going to draw it like everybody else does. We're going to use this graphic here, and we're going to fill it in with a bunch of long-term fuel trim factors for each cell. And we can see on this vehicle here there's 36 cells. Some vehicles have more, many vehicles have less. The long-term fuel trim, while in any given cell, the computer is going to monitor the short-term fuel trim. The short-term fuel trim is going to monitor the oxygen sensor. The oxygen sensor goes rich or lean. The short-term makes a correction. If it stays gone long enough or far enough, it's going to drive the long-term to make a correction, and it's going to store that in a specific cell. So as the long-term values changes, it should force the short-term fuel trim back towards zero, which is forcing the oxygen sensor back to a normal air-fuel mixture ratio report. One cell at a time. At any given load and any given RPM, the computer's dealing with one cell at a time. Now if you whack the throttle, you're at idle and you whack the throttle and you go wide open throttle, it's going to pass through those cells, but it's not going to do any correction because you're transient. Same thing if you're flying down the highway and your fuzzbuster goes off and you slam on the brakes and you start coming down through the cells. The computer's not going to make an attempt and read each cell. It knows you're transient. So what are the normal fuel factors for long-term fuel trim? Plus means we're adding fuel. And realize what that means. That means the oxygen sensor read lean or too lean, the short-term added fuel, and then the long-term started adding fuel. Or the normal values for the minus, subtracting fuel, just the opposite, can be anywhere between plus or minus 5% away from zero. Zero would be this engine is running perfectly, and I doubt if you'll ever see one. In fact, if all your long-term fuel trim cells read zero, you might want to take time, look up any TSBs so you can flash this computer back to normal, or you may have to replace the computer after checking its powers and grounds. Vehicles that are driven their wheels off, if they have 100,000 miles on them, if they look like this owner hasn't been taking good care of it with oil changes and filter changes, then you can change that plus or minus 5 to about plus or minus 10. But over 10% plus or minus is never normal. So there is another PID called total fuel trim, and what it does is it adds the short-term and the long-term values together. That PID should never exceed plus or minus 10. If the long-term fuel trim PID is changing, you're looking at the scan tool and that PID is changing, one of two things is happening. The long-term fuel trim PID should change if the throttle is changing. It's because it's traveling through the cells. If it changes and you're holding the throttle steady, then it's updating those cells. It's learning. Here is our graph that we're going to use. Load is over here and RPM is down here. When we look at that, at this particular engine speed and load, the computer is adding 3% to the injector on time to make the oxygen sensor report that we have a good air-fuel mixture. Here, over in this cell, different load, different RPM, it's minus 3%. And that's what it does for each and every cell or every option to load an RPM. There's no minus sign in this 0. So that means the computer is adding fuel. It's actually adding 0 in that case. Up here, it's a minus sign. So the computer is subtracting fuel. When there's no minus sign, it is understood to be addition, adding fuel. If there's a minus sign, then it's subtracting fuel. Plus or minus 5% is what is normal. Now, when we look at the higher value here at 6%, that's outside the plus or minus 5. It's really within the plus or minus 10. Now, this is normal on high mileage vehicles. Anything over plus or minus 10 is never normal. Here are our cells for light load operation, and everybody seems fine. They're within plus or minus 5. At medium load correction, we can see that 3 cells are out, but only by 1 percentile. And then when we get up to the heavy load, we're a little bit higher out. And then the wide open throttle correction, we can see that we're out, but we're still within plus or minus 10. What we just viewed is probably the normal car that's been well maintained and has maybe only 50,000 miles on it in your service bay. What we saw is as load and RPM increases, the engine requires additional fuel. And we can see that it wasn't getting it. There had to be a slight adjustment to long-term fuel trim. And that slight adjustment was transferred to the injector pulse width just to get a little bit more fuel. What we just saw could have been a fuel filter that's starting to plug up just at the beginning stages. It could be where the engine is starting to get carboned up, once again, just at the beginning stages. So what does it look like on a vehicle? We're showing you charts. All vehicles don't show what we're going to show you, but we are going to show you the breakdown of the cells. We chose this vehicle simply because it has the cells individually posted on PIDs. Many vehicles that you see, there's going to be one PID for long-term fuel trim. There's not going to be a whole bunch of them like there are here. In fact, 21 of them labeled 00 to 21. Now 21 is idle, so apparently they count down to get to the higher loads. When the engine is shut off, what we see here, the values we see here, is what's going to be stored in the memory in that matrix for the next startup. We're driving along, we shut it off, we run in and get our big gulp. And then the computer remembers what it was doing to fuel correction in order to have this engine run normally at startup. And then when it hits a certain cell, a certain RPM versus load, it knows what adjustment to make. What if you don't have all those cells? You can graft that PID for your fuel cells. You can see the red lines running along there at the top, and then it changes cells. That's because the transmission was shifted into drive. And you can do a test drive, and if you do it correctly, meaning that you drive slowly from idle up to a higher load, legal speed limits please, you can watch the fuel cells change, and then over in the left-hand corner there on this scan tool, we can see the actual cell and the actual value. And here, the throttle was open when the brake was applied, just like taking off from a stop sign, and we can do the same thing with that fuel cell. So if you don't have them all, like the first one we showed you, graft them so you can see individual fuel cells.